All right, let's do this. Baby's first podcast. Hi, my name is Connor. I'm the Paranormal Pixie. Welcome to my podcast. Tentatively calling it the PixieCast. So let's see if that sticks. Anyway, today I thought I would start everything off by talking about one of my favorite hauntings that I just cannot get out of my head. That of Bloody George Mackenzie in Edinburg, Scotland. So buckle up, come along with me for this ride as we look into the history of Edinburg and the history of George Mackenzie and this very violent and aggressive poltergeist activity. I hope you're ready. I am genuinely excited to look into this with you because after all of my years, I still cannot decide if this is a legitimate poltergeist haunting or if it is just a hoax made up by the local tour guides. So, Edinburg, Scotland is one of the most haunted cities in the world. You could throw a rock and find a spirit tied to some gruesome part of the city's past, whether it be the ghost of a plague victim, a murder victim, or just some nobleman. It's that kind of place. It's fantastic. In the center of the city lies Greyfriars Church, a building so ornate that it is often called the Westminster Abbey of Scotland. Westminster Abbey being the place in London where the kings and queens of England have been crowned for centuries. Greyfriars itself is built on the site of a friary where the monks wore grey caps. Greyfriars. Pretty simple. For this story, however, we are more interested in the area surrounding the church, known as the kirkyard. Kirk being Scottish for church, so really it's just churchyard, but we're going to call it kirkyard because that's what it's called, and it sounds way cooler. A kirkyard is a small 5-acre, 4 American football fields, space that contains not just the beautiful church we were talking about earlier, but also includes a cemetery containing thousands of bodies. Greyfriars could only be described as a city of the dead. Amongst the buried dead here is one of the world's most active and accessible poltergeists, Bloody George Mackenzie. George Mackenzie was a Lord Advocate to the Stuart kings during the time of extreme religious turmoil. The role of Lord Advocate can best be described as kind of an attorney to the crown. For Mackenzie's part, he advised King James II on who to persecute, how to persecute them, and what their punishments should be. Know that George Mackenzie earned the nickname Bloody Mackenzie doing this. At this point in the Scottish history is so violent, it's called the Killing Times, and that should say a lot. One of the worst atrocities during this time, and there were tons, but the one that really stands out and the one we're talking about today is going to be when George Mackenzie made the decision to imprison over 1,200 men, 1,200 Presbyterians, into an open-air prison located within the churchyard and kept them there for months with limited rations, zero protection, and rotting water. To add insult to this horrible injury that already was inflicted on church grounds, when George Mackenzie passed away, his body was brought back to Scotland and he was buried less than 100 feet from this open-air prison, from this prison where thousands, over 1,000 people were imprisoned and people died. He just happens to casually be buried outside of it, and one of the creepiest looking black stone mausoleums one could possibly find. While I was doing my research on George Mackenzie, I came across this quote from Robert Louis Stevenson that I think is the perfect way to really open this story. When a man's soul is certainly in hell, his body will scarcely lie quiet in a tomb, however costly. So that's from Robert Louis Stevenson. He wrote a book on the history of Edinburgh and he included George Mackenzie. I think that's kind of the perfect tone to set. So let's go. Let's jump in. Let's talk about this. I'm so excited to share the story of Bloody George Mackenzie's poltergeist with you all. But first, let's take a look at some of the other macabre things surrounding Greyfriars Cemetery, because why not? Let's have some more history. Let's share some more ghost stories. This place is weird and fun. For 300 years, many of Edinburgh's dead were laid to rest within Greyfriars Kirkyard. This is between the years of 1562 and 1870. While the modern ground contains only about 700 graveyard markers, which still pack the green landscape full of stones and mausoleums jutting out at odd angles, beneath those 700 grave markers, we believe lie about 100,000 bodies. And I really do mean bodies buried. For religious reasons, precious few remains were cremated at the time. So even those that died of plagues were often buried before their bodies could rot, spreading the disease. During the 18th century alone, an estimated 1,100 burials took place at Greyfriars a year. Over 1,100 people a year during the 18th century. This was resulted in some really odd methods to make everybody fit. This includes dumping fresh corpses into old mausoleums and even just piling them up all on top of each other and covering it with dirt, making a giant hill. For real. Some of the bodies are even buried so close to the surface that on rainy days, it's said that mud occasionally reveals skeletal remains. I just can't. That's incredible. When it comes to the paranormal, a person could probably spend their entire life trying to catalog every ghost story in the area around Greyfriars and still barely scratch the surface, which we obviously don't have time for, so I've picked out a couple of my favorite stories to share with you about Greyfriars. So let's go. My adorable highlight, Greyfriars Bobby. Bobby was a little Skye Terrier whose owner, John Grey, died while he was still just a puppy. The loyal doggo spent every day of the rest of his life guarding John's grave in the kirkyard and was faithfully buried nearby. Visitors today report hearing the sounds of barking and often feel a licking sensation on their hands when standing near the statue of Bobby. The story of Greyfriars Bobby is one of the most famous residents of Greyfriars. It has been retold over the years through books and even a Disney movie. Bobby's adorable statue is easy to find near a kirkyard entrance. You can also pay a visit to Bobby's collar and bowl in one of the many local museums. And since I'm a killjoy, which is going to be a trend in this, while I was researching, I learned that John Grey is actually buried in a different cemetery about a mile from Greyfriars. Is it a matter of little Bobby being confused and waiting at the wrong place? Is the whole thing made up? Or is it a matter of the myth moving from its original location to a more popular one, the kirkyard, over the years? I personally feel like it's probably the last one. You see it a lot with paranormal stories where they just kind of move to the most popular location in the area. And a story that I feel like I have to share because it is important to Greyfriars history is that of the Resurrection Men. The Scottish Enlightenment of the 1800s expanded our understanding of science and medicine by leaps and bounds. Gaining that knowledge, however, it came at a price. Doctors needed lots and lots of bodies to dissect and experiment on. Not just any bodies, though. They needed the freshest ones possible. Of course, donating one's mortal coil to science was not a popular idea back then, so doctors were semi-reliant on the corpses of either unclaimed bodies or criminals, executed criminals. Unsurprisingly, demand substantially outweighed the supply, and therefore a new seedy trade popped up to fulfill the need. They were known as resurrection men. These people would dig up the bodies of the freshly dead to sell their corpses to one of the many medical schools around Edinburgh. Doctors were very eager to look the other way about where a body came from in the name of science. The first documented case of a body going missing from Greyfriars predates the main resurrection craze. It happened in 1678. A 16-year-old Romani boy mysteriously went missing from his grave. The story was so bizarre and the boy's body never turned up in any way identifiable. Since he had been executed for murder, many people believe that he must have just played possum and gotten up and walked out of his grave. Soon, though, Edinburgh had a full-on body-snatching problem. The wealthy could afford to cover their graves with iron bars called mort safes that would keep their corpses firmly in place. But for those that could not afford such fancy measures, Greyfriars erected watchtowers along the cemetery walls so that people could look out for people carrying shovels or other suspicious characters wandering through the cemetery at night. There were dedicated families, though, people that would sit graveside watching over their loved ones for days on end, sometimes even over a month, until the body inside the ground, that of their loved ones, was rotted to the point that it was no longer useful for science, where there was no longer any monetary value in their loved one's dead body. That's some dedication. I don't know if I'd be able to stand over my family's grave for a whole month of nights. But I'm going to lie and say that I could, because that sounds better. The most famous or infamous of the resurrection men was not actually a single man, but two, William Burke and William Hare. Burke and Hare, or the Williams, if you will. The pair began their foul careers digging up bodies, but quickly learned that the freshest corpses are the ones that you make yourself. And it involves way less physical labor and digging. They also had found themselves a friendly doctor who did not care to ask follow-up questions when they were handed a body. There is no count for how many dead Burke and Hare pulled from their graves, but we do know that the pair lured and killed at least 16 living people in just over a year. That would be between 1827 and 1828. Though some more gruesome historians will tell you that the total number of murder victims is around 30. When the Williamses were finally caught, Hare immediately turned on Burke, spilling the beans in exchange for his life. Burke was hung in front of a crowd of 24,000 people. In an act of wonderful justice, the judge presiding over this case ordered William Burke's body to be devoted to science. The dissection of Burke's corpse was one of the most popular and well-attended in Scottish university history, even causing a small riot to break out as students flocked to find space in the viewing room. And before we move on, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the Harry Potter connections to Greyfriars. J.K. Rowling wrote the first Harry Potter book while living unhoused in Edinburgh. It is very easy to imagine her wandering through the kirkyard, mulling over the ideas of Horcruxes and sorting hats looking for inspiration. And you can indeed find some familiar names amongst the gravestones. There is a Crookshanks, a Moody, a McGonagall. The gravestone for James and Elizabeth Lockhart was stolen in 2022 and still has not been recovered. The most famous of the Kirkyard's Harry Potter connections is the massive tomb of Thomas Riddle, which is said to be where J.K. got the true name of Lord Voldemort. It is super easy to spot against one of the Kirkyard's walls and is a must stop by for Harry Potter fans that are visiting. I do also want to add that J.K. does not own up to getting any of the names of her characters from Greyfriars, which is hilarious because I cannot see her just pulling this many similar names out of a hat. But hey, whatever. I'm putting her 2 cents in. Harry Potter tour guides will also point out one more connection to the books in the Kirkyard, which is allegedly the inspiration for Hogwarts' most well-known spirit, Peeves the Poltergeist, which is the Black Mausoleum of Bloody George Mackenzie and the violent haunting that is still experienced to this day. This kind of part of the story makes no sense to me because, as you'll see, the main activity surrounding the Mackenzie Poltergeist does not kick up until 1999, and the Philosopher's Stone, Sorcerer's Stone came out in 1997. Anyway, I have circled it all the way back around. We are back to where we are, our main story, the Mackenzie Poltergeist. So let's get going. To refresh our memory from the beginning of this episode, George Mackenzie is a former Lord Advocate of Scotland. That is a legal expert and advisor to the Scottish Crown, which at the time was the Stuart Kings. He had this role during a period of extreme religious turmoil between Scottish citizens, known as the Covenanters, and the Tudor kings. So I waffled a little bit on how to pronounce this. Covenanters versus a lot of the Scottish people that I would listen to talk about this would call them Covenanters, which at the end of the day, I'm American, so I'm going to go with the Americanized version of it, which is Covenanters. But if I should have said it the other way or something, let me know. I just don't think that my terrible Scottish accent would do anybody any good trying to pronounce Covenanters. During this time, known as the Covenanters' Uprising or the Killing Times, 18,000 men, women, and children died. They were killed, most of them on Mackenzie's orders. When the Crown finally did win a decisive victory over the Covenanters at the Battle of Bothwell Bridge, Mackenzie ordered 1,200, that's 1,200 Covenanter prisoners of war to be kept in a makeshift open-air jail within Greyfriars kirkyard. Many of them were executed, sent to colonies, but most died of exposure. And then after Mackenzie dies, he is brought back and buried in this very creepy-looking black mausoleum that is just a few hundred feet away from the Covenanters' prison, where he sentenced all of those people to die. Just a quick little cutaway. I thought about how I wanted to do this. My original plan was to have it be a video podcast so you could see images alongside with my voice. However, where I'm at right now, my capability is just being able to record this podcast. So if you are interested in any images for what I'm talking about, any show notes that I have, my sources, and a rough transcript of this podcast, you can visit my website, paranormalpixie.com. Again, that is paranormalpixie.com for all of the backstage goodies. Shortly after George Mackenzie is buried in the Black Mausoleum next to the Covenanters prison, locals started reporting odd happenings. At the time, mostly superstitious stuff, feeling watched when you're walking by the entrance to the Black Mausoleum, feeling sad or cold spots from within the Covenanters prison. Then, something happened in 1999 that will kick all of this activity into high gear. Suddenly, people go from reporting feelings to being physically attacked, scratches, bruises, feeling pushed, and even fainting while inside the tomb. So which spirit is responsible for this violent activity? Is it the restless spirits of the Covenanters who are upset at having the man that did this to them buried next to them for all eternity? Or maybe George Mackenzie really hated the Covenanters that much and wanted to torture them even after their deaths. Maybe this whole thing is added local superstition or something that's even kind of hyped up and invented by the tour company that just happens to have exclusive access to this. Let's take a look closer and see if you can decide. But before we get back into the hauntings in history, I need to take one more quick sidetrack to talk about who the Covenanters were and what this religious movement meant. So, who are the Covenanters? They were a 16th century Scottish religious and political movement that rallied centered around this newly formed idea of the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. What originally began as a dispute over kind of church organization ended up spiraling into a giant bloody conflict regarding the entire royal authority of the Stuart kings. The Stuarts, the ruling family of Scotland at the time, believed that the king was chosen by God and had the divine right to rule. This means that some random man is deemed an infallible ruler and spiritual head of the Church of Scotland just because he happened to be born royal. So Presbyterians, the Covenanters, do not believe a mortal man, especially a king, could be the divine head of the church. It's a position that should only be held by God's one and only Son, Jesus Christ, in their opinions. This disagreement came to a boiling point in 1637 when Charles I of Scotland dropped a common book of prayer, which included prayers to the king. And they also announced that not using this prayer book was an act of treason against the crown. In 1638, the dissenting Presbyterians made their stance official by opposing the king's interference with the current Church of Scotland. They signed a brand new covenant inside Greyfriars kirkyard. And from here on out, instead of calling them Presbyterians, they will be referred to as Covenanters. The government started using more and more extreme measures to try to stamp out the Covenanter movement. What began with hefty fines for preachers spiraled into Inquisition-level style torture and for commoners that didn't attend government-approved churches, going so far as to hold an entire congregation at gunpoint once, forcing the prisoners to read from the Book of Common Prayer with muskets in their faces. The persecution of Covenanters was so brutal and widespread during this period of Scottish history, it's actually known as the Killing Times. And presiding over it all is our man, Sir George Mackenzie. He is placed in charge of prosecuting Covenanters in 1677 by Charles II. If you were taking note, this ordeal started with Charles I, and now we were on to Charles II. George Mackenzie made a name for himself and cut his teeth as a prosecutor during some Scottish witch trials. He sentenced several people to their deaths by burning at the stake, despite admitting in his personal writings that he did not believe in witchcraft. He was just sentencing humans off to die because it was expected. He liked it. I have no idea. Yeah. Things escalated further when the Covenanters assassinated the Archbishop of St. Andrews in 1679. The Covenanters felt the man, whose name was James Sharp, was working with King Charles II to undermine the Presbyterian cause. This led to the massive battle at Bothwell Bridge the same year, which did end in a crushing defeat for the revolutionary movement. However, this was not the final straw, as this back and forth continued. It dwindled down until William of Orange finally invaded and conquered England, uniting both countries in 1707. They needed a whole new government just to stop this conflict. Okay, now that the religious backstory is more or less out of the way, let's move on to the main event. The story of our haunting begins at the end of the Battle of Bothwell Bridge in 1679. 6,000 Covenanters clashed against roughly 5,000 government-backed fighters and Scottish Highlanders. The battle ended in a decisive win for Scotland's King Charles II, as many of the remaining Covenanters fled for the hills while they still could. At least that's according to the story told by King Charles II. Along with the victory at Bothwell Bridge came the capture of around 1,300 Covenanter prisons of war, which were all set to be handed off to George Mackenzie, Lord Advocate. Throughout his time as Lord Advocate, Mackenzie was ruthless. He had already publicly executed hundreds of Covenanters, leaving many of their heads and even full bodies up on display as warnings for others who had failed to pray the common book of prayers and follow the king's version of the Church of Scotland. For the political prisoners taken at Bothwell Bridge, Bloody Mackenzie had special kinds of horrors in mind. Out of the original 1,300 prisoners of war taken at Bothwell Bridge, only 1,200, so 1,200 or so of them actually reached the open-air prison in Greyfriars. The others, we assume, were either too injured to be moved and died, or managed to escape en route. It was cool and morbid as the idea of using tombs as cells is. At the time, this portion of Greyfriars Kirkyard the Covenanters were to be locked in was not a part of the cemetery proper. This inner yard, as it was called back then, was backed in part by a hospital where the surviving sick and injured prisoners of war were taken. The others were placed in a narrow 3-acre open-air block of brick cells that is now known officially as the Covenanters' Prison. For the record, bodies were not buried in the Covenanters' Prison area until 1705. Just in case you were curious, I was. The Covenanters, the men that were brought to this open-air prison, were given a single 4-ounce serving of bread a day. It was called a penny loaf because that's how much it cost. And they were provided little water. I would be willing to bet whatever water was provided was super gross because Europe didn't really understand that germs were a real thing back then. The Covenanters' only hope of getting additional nutrition was the kindness of strangers or friends that would be willing to try to sneak food to them through the bars over the guards. At night, prisoners were forced to sleep almost sitting upright in these tight jail cells. They had to stay completely still. Guards would be perched on top of the walls. Remember, there's no roof here. These men are totally exposed to the weather. If any one of the Covenanter prisoners moved, even an inch, one of the guards would shoot one of the cellmates as punishment. You're responsible for your own friend's death. This is some North Korean, Russian gulag kind of evil. But here it is. There were only a few ways out of the Covenanters' prison's horrible conditions. You could die of exposure, starvation, or illness, be executed for treason, sign a new oath of loyalty to the crown, renouncing your Presbyterian faith and agreeing not to raise arms against the crown ever again. This was known as taking the crown's peace. And finally, you could be shipped off to one of England's many colonies. This slow torture dragged on for over 5 months as the religious prisoners of war's numbers slowly dwindled until one day the Covenanters' prison finally emptied. In December of 1679, the final group of 257 Covenanters, the men that refused to die or recant their faith, got packed aboard a ship and sent to the American colonies to work as slaves. Conditions were tight aboard the ship, which was called the Crown of London, and the weather was rough. A few of the more wealthy Covenanters were able to remain on deck, I imagine to work as ship's crews, but that is unclear. However, we know that the majority of the men were kept locked in the narrow cargo hold between decks. Tragically, the Crown of London would never reach its American port. The ship sank during a violent storm. So in order to reach the American colonies, the Crown of London had to leave the eastern port of Edinburg, travel around the northern tip of Scotland through the turbulent waters near the Orkney Islands. And this is where the Crown of London found themselves caught, tossing about in freezing cold, choppy waters. The vessel started taking on water, so the only hope of survival the crew had was to try to run the ship aground and jump off of it. The captain, the entire crew, and the majority of the Covenanters that stayed above deck survived. However, the crew refused to unlock the cargo hold for the remaining prisoners as they were leaving the ship. So all but a few of them died at sea. Of the 257 Covenanters that boarded the Crown of London, only 40-ish made it out of the horrific ordeal alive, leaving over 200 men lost at sea. The vast majority of these men remain nameless and unidentified to this day. And that is true not just for the Covenanters aboard the Crown of London, but also all of them that were kept at Greyfriars. We have very little information on who they were. So, how many Covenanters died in Greyfriars then? Records at the time, unsurprisingly, are scarce and unreliable. Only 51 of the prisoners' names were recorded. Oddly, the best information we have on how many endured the Covenanters' prison horrors come from the bakery that delivered the penny loaf rations every single day. The first delivery took place on July 1st, shortly after the Battle of Bothwell Bridge, and it was for 1,184 penny loaves. The last delivery of a measly 210 loaves were dropped off on November 15th. So that is barely a span of 5 months. Which even those numbers do not quite line up with the numbers that we have from other places. Only 6 of these Covenanters had trials. 5 of them were found guilty of treason and hanged for death, and just 1 was acquitted and released. It's estimated 300 to 400 Covenanters took the crown's peace, meaning that they renounced the Presbyterian faith, pledged their loyalty back to King Charles II, and these names likely weren't recorded out of kind of like a weird honor thing, since they had pinky promised to go to the right church and use the right prayers from now on. Another 300 were banished from Scotland to other parts of Europe or to live with their families in one of England's many colonies. I am not sure if this number includes the 200 plus men aboard the Crown of London. In my notably wonky, rough math, that leaves about 500 to 700 Covenanter prisoners of war who died in Greyfriars Kirkyard. And that is where the Covenanter stories end. For centuries, the spirits of those starving men, forced to live in an open-air prison with horrendous conditions, very little sleep, after they died, their spirits would slumber, seemingly at peace, even when the very man that condemned them to their fate ended up being buried nearby. Having well earned the nickname Bloody George Mackenzie, he lived the rest of his life seemingly unashamed and unrepentant of the atrocities he took part in. From what I could find, he never faced any negative press or harm to his reputation in any notable way. He even founded the freaking National Library of Scotland. Though he did leave Scotland for England in 1688, just as the political tide started to shift against his favor. So maybe he just kind of got ahead of his accountability. Mackenzie died in London in 1690 and was brought back to Scotland to be buried at Greyfriars. Only in a place like Scotland can a man manage to be buried within a few hundred feet of one of his greatest crimes. I'm sure there are others who don't fact check me, or do fact check me. I'm actually curious now. But I have to wonder if Mackenzie's burial was planned this way. Was he so proud of prosecuting the Covenanters and sending them to death in this horrible way that he wanted to sit next to it? Or if it was just a matter of where there was space left for a big old mausoleum in the kirkyard. Either way, Mackenzie's mausoleum ends up being just a stone's throw away from the Covenanters' prison. His large grave has elegant columns and a dome all made of black stone. Over the time, it has earned the nickname the Black Mausoleum, both because of the tomb's color and its dark history. As I mentioned before, if you are interested in seeing photos of the Black Mausoleum, in addition to show notes or anything else like that, you can check it out on my website, paranormalpixie.com. I'm sure you can also Google them too, but please check out my website. The Mackenzie Poltergeist. The first inkling that Bloody Mackenzie and the Covenanters were no longer resting peacefully came in the early 19th century. A criminal named John Hayes had managed to elude capture by living inside the Black Mausoleum for 6 months. He was reliant on his friends to help keep his secret and bring him food. When the police finally caught wind of where Hayes was hiding, he had gone completely stark, raving mad. He told the police that the caskets inside the Black Mausoleum shifted at night, as if the bodies inside them were twisting in their sleep, restless. Worst of all, Hayes said, was the loud, desperate, scratching sounds coming from inside the coffin containing Mackenzie, as if something was trying to tear its way out, as if it had been buried alive. Boys from the nearby boarding school, that's actually in the former hospital building, began to stand in front of the locked entrance to the Black Mausoleum and taunt the spirit of Bloody Mackenzie to prove its existence. I was originally going to try to say this in a Scottish accent, but I don't want to offend anybody, so I am just going to kind of do the Americanized version. Taunting. Bloody Mackenzie, come out if you dare. Open the lock and lift the bar. Despite John Hay's fall into insanity and generations of schoolboys poking the bear by chanting in front of the tomb, Mackenzie's crypt and the nearby Covenanters' prison remained fairly quiet. That is until 1998. A homeless man is desperately looking for a place to hide during a brutal downpour. He manages to force his way into the Black Mausoleum to escape the rain. He searches around the room getting his bearings, and his eyes lock onto Mackenzie's coffin. Hoping that the untouched burial might contain gold or other jewels he could sell, the homeless man pries open the coffin. When the lid splits apart, a horrifying guttural scream fills the homeless man's ears, and he sees a vision of a grotesque white face. As the man reels back from Mackenzie's body, the ground crumbles from beneath him and he falls straight through, landing tangled in the middle of an underground room full of skeletal remains. These skeletal remains are not thought to be part of Mackenzie's family in any way. Most people believe that they're likely plague victims that had died and then were hastily buried to avoid the spread. Especially when, numbers are strapped and it's a plague, burying bodies in existing tombs is a heck of a lot easier than digging new graves. The story of who discovered the screaming homeless man in the Black Mausoleum during the early rainy hours in a creepy cemetery varies by who is telling it. The main tour company tied to the Mackenzie Poltergeist, City of the Dead Tours, and the book written by its founder called The Ghost That Haunted Itself, says that a random lady walking her dog received the fright of her life, while some other tours claim that it was a very surprised groundskeeper. There is no way to tell who is telling the real story here, because there are no contemporary records. There is no police reports or any news articles about this incident involving a homeless man. It seems like one of those things that should disqualify a tale, not having any records. But who knows? It's Scotland. Maybe everybody just agreed not to talk about it. Still, immediately after this incident, people walking through the kirkyard started reporting weird things happening around the Black Mausoleum and the Covenanters' prison. Things like feeling watched and hearing breathing sounds coming from inside Mackenzie's grave, or cold spots so bitter that it physically hurts inside the Covenanters' prison. To curb the rumors and protect both locations from vandals, the Edinburg City Council decided to lock off both Mackenzie's Black Mausoleum and the Covenanters' prison. Still, reports of white figures inside the prison are frequent. And with that, Mackenzie's Poltergeist became Greyfriars' newest tourist attraction. In 1999, some local tourists, led by Jan Andrew Henderson, banded together to found City of the Dead Tours. The group was made up of knowledgeable historians that were already well known in the area and had very skeptical opinions towards the paranormal. When they first learned of the Mackenzie Poltergeist, they knew that it had the potential to bring in guests. Since Jan Andrew already was well established as an expert tour guide, he was able to successfully petition the city council for the key to the mausoleum and Covenanters' prison. And with that, the Black Mausoleum and the Covenanters' prison officially became the epic final tale on City of the Dead's Greyfriars tour. Jan Andrew Henderson would also go on to literally write the book on the Mackenzie Poltergeist. It's called The Ghost That Haunted Itself and was published in 2008. And I have used it as a major source for this section of this podcast. It includes not only his personal experiences with Bloody George, but tons of first-hand accounts from people that took the tour or lived near that particular section of the kirkyard. Apparently, even within the first few tour groups taken to see Mackenzie's poltergeist, guests started to report feeling touched or grabbed, scratches appearing out of nowhere, and sudden bouts of extreme nausea. By the end of the first year, every tour guide at City of the Dead had changed their minds on the paranormal. They also probably changed their insurance policy because whatever was happening with Bloody George Mackenzie and the Covenanters prison kept escalating. Soon guests started to collapse with shocking regularity inside the enclosed black mausoleum, only regaining consciousness after they had been taken outside to fresh air. They also reported a strange, sickly sweet smell coming from within inside the Covenanters prison. The scent would stop right at the chain link fence blocking off the area. According to the book, The Ghost That Haunted Itself, City of the Dead tours kept count. In the first 2.5 years after they were founded, 92 people had passed out inside the Black Mausoleum. On June 30th, 2003, a tour guide called the police after spotting 2 people running out of the Black Mausoleum carrying something wrapped in a blanket. Turns out that a pair of teenagers, aged 15 and 17, had broken in to try to impress their friends. The object that they were carrying was Mackenzie's rotted skull to show as proof of their dumbass stunt. These guys were minors, so I have no names or descriptions of them, but the boys had apparently been hanging out in the crypt for a while, long enough to get the profane idea to use a head as a puppet by sticking their hand up its severed neck. It was not confirmed, at least that I found, exactly whose head was stolen and used this way, but the rumor is Mackenzie, and I'm going to stick with that because it sounds cool, and that's what the teens claimed. In total, about 10,000 pounds worth of damages were done to the coffins and stonework in the Black Mausoleum. The 17-year-old was even bold enough to revisit the scene of his crime with his girlfriend a few days later. To put a button on the grave desecration saga of Mackenzie, in the 2003 boys were charged under the same body snatching law that Burke and Hare were tried on all those centuries before. See, it wasn't a useless story. There was a point. Luckily for the modern teens, the sentencing was much lighter than what happened to Burke and Hare, and they got off with some fines and a short time of probation. One little fact that I find really interesting about this particular chapter in the Mackenzie Poltergeist saga is that this act of vandalism that these teenage boys did happened almost exactly to the date the Covenanters were brought to their outdoor prison in the kirkyard, 324 years prior. The kids were caught outside of Mackenzie's mausoleum late at night on June 30th, 2003, and the prisoners arrived at Greyfriars July 1st, 1879. Anniversaries can often be something that's very important or relevant to a paranormal encounter, so I do feel like it's worth noting because the experiences that people had inside the Black Mausoleum in the Covenanters prison, they just kept stacking up after this. Between 1999 and 2004, the City of the Dead tours racked up about 350 pieces of first-hand testimony about the Mackenzie Poltergeist and witnessed 140 people collapse. Again, that's according to the book The Ghost That Haunted Itself. It's my favorite resource. I absolutely suggest you reading it if you have any interest in this beyond what I am telling you. People just wandering through Greyfriars started reporting seeing dead birds found around the Black Mausoleum and in Covenanters prison. These birds were found without any injuries or other obvious causes of death. The little guys just seemed to have collapsed while resting or flying into the buildings. Of course, paranormal groups and TV channels come from all over the world to test for themselves if Mackenzie's poltergeist is the real deal. Crews from a Polish news network, as well as Discovery Channel, were said to have had frightening experiences inside the Black Mausoleum, but I could not find video of either of them to share. One very brave minister, Colin Grant, attempted to exorcise Mackenzie's resting place in November of 1999. Recently, an unsettling final photo of Grant resurfaced, taken by the journalist that was along with him, including a short interview that they gave. Grant was visibly shaken by what he experienced while trying to cleanse evil from the Black Mausoleum. Before he and the journalist left Greyfriars in failure, he turned to the journalist saying, "I wouldn't be surprised if this killed me." 2 weeks later, Grant, a pretty healthy guy, died unexpectedly of a heart attack. It almost feels like the poltergeist reach began to expand over the years. Residents of the businesses and housings backing this part of the cemetery also started to report paranormal activity over the years. Things like lights turning off or on when nobody was in the room, or very clear sounds of footsteps in unoccupied rooms. Even issues with bathroom plumbing and things like that. One of these units was actually occupied by the City of the Dead founder, Jan Andrew Henderson, and was used as one of the tour offices. In his book, he has some really fun, just wild stories of a skeptic failing to see obvious haunting signs. But shortly after that second grave robbing attempt, all of those haunted buildings suddenly burst into flames, causing extensive damage and displacing all of its residents. I can't say definitively that it was a ghost that burned down these properties. Honestly, if you look at it and it all matches up, it seems more likely that there was faulty wiring causing a lot of these problems. But there's no way to tell for sure, and it did affect a lot of people just because their houses happened to be nearby Bloody George Mackenzie's Black Mausoleum. So, where does the Mackenzie Poltergeist stand today? People continue to have encounters with Bloody George and the Covenanters. City of the Dead Tours has an Instagram where they post first-hand experiences, an image of the guests' scratches and marks they've got on whole tours, also any audio that might have been caught, or videos. They also post pictures that supposedly contain spirits. I personally couldn't see any that I couldn't explain, but that seems to be a problem on my part. I'm always very critical of ghost photos. You'll learn if you don't know already. Guests on tours report weird smells, intense weather changes, and an evil presence, feeling touched or scratched. They even report this kind of paranormal activity once they've left Edinburg. They say that Mackenzie followed them home, and that's when they started seeing scratches or bruising. It's an interesting idea. Is the Mackenzie Poltergeist power growing more and more as people believe in it and visit and want to encounter it? Have the souls of the dead become more restless and eager to lash out as guests continue to disturb their resting place daily, nightly? Jan Andrew Henderson, the discoverer of the Mackenzie Poltergeist and founder of City of the Dead Tours, came up with his own theory to explain the phenomena. He calls it the pheromone theory. And I actually really like this. Essentially, the fear and excitement people experience inside the Covenanters prison and Black Mausoleum puts out pheromones. That makes sense so far. People put out pheromones. Fear is its own type. The anxiety of it is its own type. Those pheromones, they don't just feed into and off of the pheromones of other people in your group, in your tour group, but they feed off the collective that has built up there, especially inside the small Black Mausoleum. They've built up there over years till a guest gets overwhelmed and has a paranormal experience. It's not a perfect theory. It still does not explain the physical marks that show up on some guests. It does sort of explain why most of the negative experiences come from within the Black Mausoleum, where pheromones hang around and become more concentrated. Also, why there would be less activity in the Covenanters prison, which, since it's open air still to this day, you know, pheromones, they clear very quickly. Like I said, I kind of enjoy this theory. I think that it does make a lot of sense. I think that when we want to experience something, especially something paranormal, it almost feels like the less likely you are to see it when you're on your own. But if you are with a group of people that really want to have a paranormal encounter, I can say from experience, you are more likely to have one. And is that just kind of your pheromones, your own body, the people that you're with, bodies kind of contributing to what you experience in your psyche? Anyway, I am done waxing poetic about theories for this. There's just as much proof, I feel like, for a genuine haunting. The occurrences have stacked up. The historical information is all stacked up. There are some holes in this. You know, the original story about the criminal that hid in there and heard Mackenzie screaming, you know, scratching in his coffin. There's no proof of that. There's no proof of the homeless man in 1999 that disturbed the grave and fell through to the skeletons. But it's so compelling, even without those two major contributors to what would cause or trigger a haunting in a location. Anyway, I'm sure you all want to know how to visit Mackenzie's Poltergeist today. If you plan on visiting Scotland soon, I recommend going to Edinburg. If you're in Scotland, go to Edinburg. I don't skip it. But if you want to take a chance at experiencing the Mackenzie Poltergeist, I recommend going on City of the Dead tours. They have exclusive access to the Black Mausoleum and the Covenanters prison. You're not going to get any closer to it. I feel the need to say here that I have personally never been on City of the Dead tour. I do not know any of the ghost tour guides or anything like that. I can speak from my experience for years of being a paranormal tour guide. They seem like a pretty fun tour group to go and be a part of. And so I report back to me if you go. I want to know how much they pay the city for that exclusive access. I think that is incredible. And they have a lot to benefit from making this story bigger. I say that in like applause. But if you want to go, if you want to see Mackenzie, if you would like to go on the City of the Dead tours, you can book through their website, but you can also stop by their new headquarters and the smallest bookstore in Edinburg to book yourself a seat on their tour. It's conveniently located inside Greyfriars in one of those watchtowers built for keeping your eye out for resurrection men. It is called the Creepy Wee Bookshop in the Graveyard. Absolutely perfect name. And yeah, check it out. Go. I think it sounds fun. I want to go. Like a lot of paranormal tours, they do very much caution care. They don't allow children under 2 or children under 12, pregnant women, anybody that has mobility issues. They advise against or flat out do not allow on the Mackenzie Poltergeist tour and several others. And I also assume that there's probably this great waiver to sign because, yeah, as a ghost tour guide, former ghost tour guide, the idea of the insurance that City of the Dead must have and these waivers to sign, I absolutely applaud them because that is so much effort and a very dangerous position that they're putting themselves in. But yeah, Greyfriars is open 24/7, so you can go anytime, any day to visit the Black Mausoleum or the Covenanters prison. You will not be able to get inside, but you will be able to stand outside and see if you can feel the bloody mausoleum, the Black Mausoleum of Bloody George Mackenzie breathe in and out. staring into the black hole of the doors. So that's it. The story of Bloody George Mackenzie's Poltergeist out of Greyfriars Kirkyard, Scotland. I really hope that you enjoyed this. If you did, I highly recommend picking up Jan Anderson's book, The Ghost That Haunted Itself. It is one of my favorite paranormal true story reads, which is why I wanted to do this. So anyway, thank you so much for listening to the first episode of the PixieCast. I really appreciate it. If you don't know me personally and have gotten this far, oh my gosh, thank you so much. You mean the world to me. Thank you, everybody listening. But I realized that I didn't introduce myself. So hi, my name is Connor. I am the Paranormal Pixie. I have worked as a paranormal historian for over a decade. I have done ghost tours and run ghost tours in multiple cities, including Washington, D.C. and here in Los Angeles, where I am based now. I wanted to use this PixieCast as a way to share stories that I have learned that didn't necessarily fit on my tour route, or things that fit my other interests. So you're going to hear things from ghost stories like this one, to interesting historical figures, to even some superhero movie like tea and kind of drama there. So this is just kind of a catch-all, and I really appreciate you being here. I'm going to try to make this a monthly thing. So with that, thank you so much for being here. You can find on the socials. My website, paranormalpixie.com, will have show notes, images, and a rough transcript of this podcast. And then my Instagram,